Hello and welcome everyone to the daily news analysis of 29th of November 2023। तो इम्पोर्टेंट आर्टिकल आज की जितने सारे हैं हिंदू न्यूज़पेपर से वन बाय वन डिस्कस कर लेते हैं। पहला जो है केरला गवर्नर साइंस ए बिल रिजर्व्स द 7 फॉर प्रेसिडेंशियल एक्सेंट। देन टाइम फॉर एक्शन ऑन पैकिंग द दुबई क्लाइमेट मीटिंग ए नॉन स्टार्टर। Then the challenge of maritime security in the global south, the need to disclose political donations, RBI's latest move to increase risk weight for lending. Then last one जो है Muslim student strength in higher education fell by 1.79 lakh in 2020-21. Kerala governor signs a bill reserves 7 for presidential assent. After a hiatus of at least 2 years and bitter political and legal wrangling between the Raj Bhavan and the Kerala government, Governor Arif Muhammad Khan signed one bill passed by the Kerala Legislative Assembly into law. The gubernatorial assent to the bill came after the Supreme Court asked Mr. Khan's office to factor in its latest judgment holding governors responsibility for acting within the four corners of the state legislature without flexing a non-existent veto power over bills presented to them for assent. The bill approved by Mr. Khan was the Kerala Public Health Bill 2022. The law proposes a comprehensive approach to public health beyond diseases, diagnosis and cure. However, the legal and political row between Mr. Khan and the government seemed unlikely to ease anytime soon. Mr. Khan has exercised his power under Article 200 of the Constitution by reserving 7 bills for the president's consideration. Notably, the Constitution imposes no deadline on the president to decide on the outcome of a bill. The legislation reserved for presidential consideration include the controversial Kerala Lok Sabha Lok Ayukt Amendment Bill and the Kerala University Amendment Bill. Mr. Khan had publicly opposed the amendment that accords appellate authority to the political executive to review Lok Ayukt's declaration of maladministration and corruption. Such declaration ban guilty persons from the holding public office. Mr. Khan has repeatedly held that no person could be a judge in his own cause. The argument that the law to defang the Lok Ayukt tentativeness to fighting sorry to fighting down the powers of a high court. The powers of High Court paved the way for Mr. Khan to refer the legislation to the President. The government had defended the amendment by stating that the original Lok Ayukt law lacked an appeal provision and such absolute power was constitutionally untenable and violative of natural justice. Mr. Khan has also reserved the contentious Kerala University Amendment Act 2022 for presidential review. The politically touchy law seeks to remove the governor as chancellor of the state university. It also empowers the government to supplant the governor with a renowned person with academic expertise as a chancellor of the different varsities. The gubernatorial assent to the one bill might do little to stop the government and Raj Bhavan from pitting their political and legal wits against each other. Then next is time for action. COP28 must compel its signatories to take definitive actions. The next fortnight will see world leaders, industrialists, activists, and indigenous people converge at the 28th edition of the Conference of Parties COP. This annual affair is an attempt to inch ahead on getting at least 190 countries, all members of the United Nations Climate Framework, to act on winning their economies of fossil fuel. The current goal is to make good on collective commitment made by countries in Paris in 2015 to strive to hold global temperatures to no higher than 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels by the end of the century and definitely below 2 degrees centigrade. Despite countries unanimously agreeing that humanity will collectively bear a huge price if these limits are breached, and nearly all major economies framing grand national plans to show how they are doing their bit. The science says that instead of being cut 8% annually, emissions have grown 1.2% from 2021-2022. At this rate, the world will warm 2.5 to 3 degree by the end of the century. There have already been 86 instances just this year of global temperature reaching the dreaded 1.5 degree centigrade threshold. In the nearly 3 decades of COP meeting, the major economies have agreed on three broad principles. Countries that rapidly industrialized in 20th century have disproportionately emitted more carbon than their fair share given the population sustained economic growth premised on fossil fuel consumption, while cheaper per unit than renewable energy spells disaster. And developing countries and those with minimal industrial infrastructure today must be compensated for adopting costlier but cleaner non-fossil fuel sources for growing their economies. There is also a consensus that the countries already weathering climate disasters must be compensated and also paid to bolster their infrastructure. However, getting all countries to actually act on these principles is one rush given the mutual suspicion, the spirit of deglobalization and fear of political reprisal that heads of governments face within their constituencies. These themes are expected to play out this year too. The two major issues are expected to take the stage: the conclusion of the global stocktake and the operationalization of the loss and damage fund. However, there is no clarity on the size of the fund and the individual contributions by countries, while COPs by nature are congratulatory when all they deliver are arguments with elaborate caveats. COP28 must strive to live up to its declared goal of being a conclave that compels its signatories to take definite actions. Then next, the Dubai climate meeting. Unpacking the Dubai climate meeting. As December draws nearer, so does the volume and intensity of global conservation around climate change negotiations. In early December, the 20th annual conference of the parties COP28 to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change will take place in Dubai. While climate change diplomacy occurs in multiple fora, including G20 meeting, United Nations summit, and bilateral fora. The COP remains the climate governance gets built because all countries, not only the powerful, have a voice at COPs. The questions of equity and vulnerability are more likely to be played on the table. In what has become a disturbingly familiar pattern, 2023 has seen devastating weather events, extreme heat in North Africa and Europe, wildfires in Canada and Hawaii, floods in India and Libya, and droughts in the Horn of Africa. By September, scientists were expressing astonishment at how much land and ocean temperatures increases and Antarctic sea ice decrease have deviated from past records, likely exacerbated by an El Nino effect. It is likely that 2023 will be the warmest year on record, but long standing disagreements over what is a fair and equitable approach to addressing climate change and who will pay remains on the boil. To make matters worse, the geopolitical context is not favorable for enhanced cooperations. The US and China have only recently tried to put the brakes on a deteriorating relationship and the Ukraine war and the horrific situation in Gaza have polarized public opinion and countries. Diplomats at are tasked then with addressing an ever more urgent problems under challenging conditions for global cooperation, and COPs are an unwieldy instrument with which to manufacture cooperation. They result in a torrent of words that are intended but often fail to unleash concrete actions. What can we expect from Dubai's COP? Then global stock take. At the top of the agenda is the fast global stocktake, a key part of the Paris Agreement machinery. The GST is at the heart of a five-yearly ambition cycle, which consists of country pledges for climate action, a global assessment of progress through the GST, and the renewed country pledges. By assessing aggregate, not individual country progress in mitigation, adaptation, and support finance, technology, and capacity, the GST is meant to drive the ratchet, ratcheting up of country pledges. The GST definitely finds, as do other United Nations and independent reports, that greenhouse gas emissions pathways are not on track to limit warming up to the Paris targets by up 2 degrees centigrade or 1.5 degrees centigrade. But the agreement ends there. What is to be done about it? Developing countries argue that the GST must look at the past efforts and bring accountability for the failure of many developed countries to do what they argue is consistent with equity. Developed countries argue that developing countries will account for the bulk of future emissions and GST should focus on limiting emissions Going forward, the outcomes of this debate will shape whether the disproportionate responsibility of developed countries for emissions is adequately reflected in future benchmarks for action. For example, one way to recognize responsibility is to expect developed countries to reach net zero emission earlier than developing countries. A core task of the is to inform and drive the next round of bottom-up national pledges by 2025. Nationally determined contribution mandated by 2025. But should the GST be prescriptive about this as some developed countries have argued and called for pledges to be in specific forms such as absolute emission targets and aligned with specific temperature targets like 1.5 degrees centigrade? Those arguing for prescription say it is needed to accelerate progress, yet there is a catch. Benchmarking a country against a temperature outcomes requires a prior agreement on what each country can fairly be asked to do to limit emissions. But we have no such agreements because this issue has been at the heart of thought climate politics. Without it, any benchmarking is arbitrary and risks not adequately considering equity, which is why developing countries argue against a prescriptive approach. However, the GST not only calls for greater ambition, it also calls for enhanced implementation of pledges. This is a productive direction because it focuses on actions countries can and should take now versus uncertain future statement of intent for future decades. To give implementation concrete form, the CUP is likely to include languages that call for countries to triple renewable energy and double energy efficiency, ideas that were notably included in the recent G20 Delhi Leaders Declarations. The question of fossil fuel, but not all of the text is agreed. Particularly contentious is a call for a limit bound phase down of fossil fuel, but here the exact phrasing will matter. India has been among those advocating a broad focus on all fossil fuel versus a narrow focus on coal alone, as was included in prior COPs. While coal is indeed the most polluting, addressing climate change requires addressing all fossil fuels. Moreover, oil and gas are much larger sources of energy in the developed world and critical to petrostates such as Dubai. While India depends more on coal, an escape hatch that oil and coal exporters may seek is the addition of the word unabated before fossil fuel to signal that plants using new technologies to capture their emissions may be allowed, giving fossil fuel a longer lease of life. The fossil fuel text is likely to be contentious and win headlines at COP28. Adoption and finance. Adoption has often been the neglected dimension of climate negotiations. COP28 is an opportunity to correct this because a global goal on adaptation is to be agreed setting on flat, consistent targets for enhancing resilience and adaptive capacity. These have proved challenging to frame because of a varying context across countries and what is required for resilience. As with other issues, the question of who pays is also likely to be prominent since the last COP. There have been calls for doubling of adaptation finance. As explosive issue is the establishment of loss and damage fund agreement on which was a hard-won gain from the last COP. This COP is tasked with advancing progress in a pre-negotiation. A fragile consensus was won on several thorny issues, including who will pay into the fund. Developed countries are urged and developing countries are encouraged, and who will receive the vaguely worded, particularly vulnerable countries, perhaps most contentious, the World Bank and was agreed as an interim host of the fund, but under strict governance guidelines to provide a greater say for recipient countries. Whether this consensus holds or unravels will be a key issue in COP28. The GST is careful to call up for ambition not only in action but also support for those actions, notably finance. Over a decade ago, developed countries had pledged to provide an arbitrary $100 billion a year by 2020. In addition to the deadline being unmet, the amount was likely too little to meet needs by COP28. The discussion has shifted to a concrete assent of needs to support mitigation and adoption, with numbers hovering in low trillion. Coming up with a number is only a starting point. The contentious issues remains around how it will be mobilized, how important is public versus private funds, will private capital flow in response to efforts to de-risk investment opportunities, are larger changes in the global finance environment needed, including debt restructuring and reform of more trilateral development banks. How can they be brought about? As the finance discussion suggested, the climate change is now on the menu at the geopolitical and geoeconomic high table. The stake for countries from COPs are consequential in terms of climate impact, fossil fuel energies, politics, and competitiveness in emergent energy technologies. All this will be resolved in Dubai, but it will be an important marker in the slow unfolding of global climate politics. The next is a non-starter. Good intentions do not always make for sound policy. President Draupadi Murmu's suggestion that the creation of an All India Judicial Service (AIJS) will help diversify the judiciary by allowing bright youngsters from varied backgrounds to become judges through a merit-based process revives the debate on whether a national system of recruitment at the district judge level is desirable. The idea has been mooted and discussed in the past and has been part of a discussion on official policy in the Union government for, for years. However, as the Union Law Minister disclosed last year in the Rajya Sabha, there is no consensus on the proposal. Only two high courts agreed to the idea, while 13 were against it. The AIJS may not be the panacea. It appears to be the current system of recruitment of district judges through the respective high courts and other subordinate judicial officers through public service commissions is more conducive to ensuring diversity as there is scope for both reservation and a clear understanding of local practices and conditions. Unlike the civil service, judges are not assisted by an experienced lawyer bureaucracy in decision making and they required to be well versed in the issues involved for judicial functioning. Article 312 of the Constitution as amended by 42nd Amendment provides for the creation of AIJS and requires a resolution adopted by the Council of States with a two-third majority and a parliamentary law. The Constitution recognizes that the rules governing the subordinate judiciary in the states will have to be superseded by a central law for this proposal to achieve fruition. It is unlikely that all states will agree to one more subject from their domain being consumed by centralization. On the face of it, it may appear that a national service for judges, not inferior to the post of district judges, with a super Annuation or age of 60 will be an attractive proposition for young lawyers to apply for it. However, it cannot be forgotten that legal education lack, lacks a country-wide uniformity. After enrolling, lawyers typically consider judicial service based on practical experience rather than academic brilliance. Toppers, especially from the few elite law schools are unlikely to sit for National Judicial Service recruitment examination. In comparison, options such as litigation, joining law firms, and going into the corporate sector will appear more beneficial further, given that the number of district judges elevated to high courts is much lower than those from the bar. The lack of certainty on career progression may also render a national judiciary service unattractive. Then next is the challenge of maritime security in the global south. Darwin is reputed to have argued that the key to human survival is not humankind's innate superiority but its natural adaptability. He felt that it was not the strongest or most intelligent species that survived, but the one with the capacity to adapt and adjust the changing environment. Darwin's notion of resilient adaptability has withstood the test of time. It is a tourism that all human progress requires a flexible approach to dealing with emerging challenges, none more so than in the maritime domain. Now, threats in the maritime domain in recent years, hard security challenges in the maritime domain have acquired a new menacing dimension, whether with Ukraine's growing use of asymmetrical tactics against Russia in the Black Sea or China's deployment of maritime militia in the South China Sea. There is an unmistakable element of improvisation. The radical new tactics at sea involves the use of grey zone warfare, land attack missiles, and combat drones. It is intuitive, however, that the bulk of the demand for maritime security in recent years has come from states facing unconventional security threats such as illegal fishing, natural disaster, marine pollution, human and drug trafficking, and the impact of climate change. These are difficult to fight using only military means. States must instead be prepared to commit capital, resources, and specialist personnel over prolonged periods to meet security needs. Throughout its G20 presidency, India has sought to emphasize the concerns of global south in discussions to find solutions on to the most pressing issues in the maritime domain. Yet there is no functioning template to fight non-traditional threats at sea. Sustainable development goals in the littoral remains unrealized as voices from littoral states in Asia, Africa, and Southern Pacific are ignored by the developed countries. There is a widespread perception in the global south that the zero-sum competition among powerful nations in the Indo-Pacific has been too the detriment of the developing world. The contemporary security agenda is an interconnected set of objectives involving national, environmental, economic, and human security goals. The cross-judicial linkage between these diverse areas make them challenging to manage. This phenomena is particularly pronounced in the global south, which finds itself especially challenged in meeting the objective of marine governance. What is more, rising sea levels, marine pollution, climate change, and natural disasters have had a disproportionate impact on less developed states, placing them in a position of vulnerability. Worryingly, littoral states in Asia and Africa have unequal law enforcement capabilities and lack of the security coordination required to jointly combat maritime threats. Many have varying security priorities and are not always willing to leverage partner capabilities to combat threats such as privacy, armed robbery, and maritime terrorism. Some even resist maritime cooperation with partner nations in a bid to reduce reliance on foreign agencies. They are willing to share information with such states, but only enough to advance common minimum security goals. Creative models. Maritime security is more than a matter of hard military actions and law enforcement. Sea power is increasingly about generating prosperity and meeting the aspirations of the people. India's Maritime Vision 2030 sets out a creative model. This 10-year blueprint for maritime sector envisages the development of a port, shipping, and inland waterways as a way of generating growth and livelihood. Dhaka's inaugural official document on the Indo-Pacific details guiding principle and objective that demonstrate a developmental approach to maritime security focused on the provisioning of goods and services and the protection of marine resources. The talks in Africa too is about a thriving blue economy and a secure maritime domain. This does not detract from the economicity of the task in the southern seas. In particular, the fight against illegal fishing in Asia and Africa, the sharp uptick in illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing has been aided by faulty policies that encourages destructive fishing methods such as bottom trawling and Scene fishing environmentalist highlights three specific anomalies: lenient regulation that allow for the misuse of resources, lax implementation of the law by security agencies, and the harmful impact of subsidies that states offer to incentivize smaller fishermen to shift to motorized trawling. Among the proposals that set out ways to deal with the maritime challenges in India's Indo-Pacific Oceans Initiative, it rests on several pillars including maritime ecology, marine resources, capacity building, disaster risk reductions, and maritime connectivity. It acknowledges that countries need collective solution to their common problem, especially since they remain economically independent. It is to India's credit that the initiative has the support of major Indo-Pacific states, many from the West. Then no consensus. Even so, implementing a collaborative strategy is challenging since it requires maritime agencies to improve interoperability, interoperability, share intelligence, and agree on a regional rules-based order. State must adapt to an integrated form of maritime security operations and overall regulatory framework to align domestic regulations with international law. An unappealing proposition for many that continue to prioritize sovereignty and strategic independence over collective actions. Unsurprisingly, consensus eludes the global south, notwithstanding their espoused positions on the need for cooperative security architecture. Many littoral states are reluctant to pursue concrete solutions to the challenges at the sea. It highlights a paradox of non-traditional maritime security that collective issue that developing nations face and the creative solution they seek are at odds with their sense of political and strategic autonomy. The next है the need to disclose political donations. With the hearings in the Supreme Court on the electoral bonds challenge have concluded, it is a good time to discuss how important the outcomes of this challenge will be to democracy and rule of law in India. Political parties in any country play an indispensable role in the democratic process. They form the government and have the responsibility under our constitution of holding the government to account. It is thus essential that the parties are adequately funded in a manner which enjoys public confidence. The amendments made to the Representation of the People's Act 1951 and other laws which provides for electoral bonds provides complete anonymity to political donors. This the requirement all over the world on this issue. On the other hand, has been the diametrical opposite to requirement of a full disclosure on the donation to political parties, either by individuals or corporations. Regulating political funding. As far back in 1910, the United States of America enacted the Publicity Act, which not only made all funding of political parties and candidates to be disclosed, it also imposed limits on political contribution. There were also other laws which regulated these limits and imposed limits on campaign spending. These conditions were challenged, and the U.S. Supreme Court in Buckley versus Valeo in 1976 not only upheld the public disclosure requirements of funding of political parties but also upheld the limits on contribution be received as being constitutional. It held that to the extent that large contributions are given to secure a political quid pro quo from current and potential office holders, the integrity of the system of representative democracy is undetermined. The danger is not of actual quid pro arrangements, but of the appearance of a cooperation and the opportunities for abuse inherent with large financial contribution. Even when the contributions are fully disclosed, the mere impression of misuse may be sufficient to erode confidence in the political system and democracy. In 2014, the European Union enacted a regulation of European Parliament and all the Council of Funding of European political parties and European political foundations. Under this regulation, there were limits set on the value of donation that parties and foundations may accept for per year and per donors, while donations from natural persons under a certain value can be anonymized. All donations exceeding that value have to be disclosed. Large donation above a certain value require not just disclose but immediate reporting to the authority. Further, political parties are also required to file annual financial statement of their revenue and expenditure. Their list of donors of and corresponding donation in the UK under the Political Parties Election and Referendum Act 2000. There are restrictions on donations and loans a political party can accept, and requirements for the declaration of the source of donations. There are thus two distinct requirements that most of legal regulations have for funding of political parties: complete disclosure of donors above certain minimal amounts and limits of or caps on donations. The need for disclosure. We need public disclosure of funding because political parties are the pillar of a representative democracy, and transparent account are the key to preserving citizens' trust in parties and politicians, maintaining the rule of law and removing corruption in the electoral and political processes. Limits on donations are imposed because the unchecked large donation to political parties and their donations to the political parties, their allies have to have the effect of bringing democracy into disrepute. The outcomes of elections should not depend on which party has more money to campaign and or buy voters. The separation of wealth from power is a basic condition of a democratic system. The road ahead, a key element of democracy is electoral justice. Electoral justice ensures that every action, procedure, and decision related to the electoral process is in line with the law and that the enjoyment of electoral rights are protected. An electoral justice system upholds the rule of law and guarantees the democratic principles of holding free fair and genuine elections. Electoral bonds which keep donors' detail undisclosed are violative of the democratic requirements of transparency and will undermine free, fair elections. Therefore, merely holding them unconstitutional is not enough. For healthy democracy, it is absolutely necessary that we have a law that ensures the full publication of all donations made to the political parties. We need a separate legislation that mandates public disclosure of identity of donors to political parties, candidates or political foundations which are above a certain nominal limits, the immediate reporting of large donation to the election commission, mandating that the political party accounts to be made public and reported to the Election Commission. Auditing of accounts of political parties by an independent authority, setting limits on funding and expenditure by the political parties are mechanism on enforcement of law. We need to make our democracy healthy by enacting legislation that regulates political party funding and mandates public disclosure. The next is RBI's latest move to increase risk weights for lending. Seeking to rein in an observed rise in unsecured personal loans and credit cards, the Reserve Bank of India detected banks and non-banking financial companies (NBFCs) to reserve more capital for risk weights. The mandatory risk weight requirement has been increased by 25% points. This would be applicable to unsecured personal loans, credit cards, and lending to NBFCs. What has the RBI proposed? The idea is to address the notion of credit risk. It refers to risk entailed by a borrower being unable to meet their obligations of or defaulting on commitments. Risk weights are an essential tool for banking banks to manage this risk. This metric is percentage factor adjust for risk associated with a certain asset type. In other words, it is an indicator of essential holding. The lender should ideally have to adjust the associated risk. This is what the RBI has directed to be increased. The primary purpose of effective risk management by banks is to maximize their returns by maintaining a credit risk exposure within a acceptable parameters. Earlier, the RBI had raised concerns about the growth seen in consumer credit and increased dependency of NBFCs on bank borrowings. Now it has directed that the risk weight for consumer credit exposure be increased by 25% percentage point to 125% for all commercial banks and NBFCs. This would apply to personal loans, excluding housing loan, education loan, vehicle loans, and loans secured by gold jewelry. At present, exposure in this realm mandate a risk weight of 100%. Credit card loans of scheduled commercial banks and currently attract a risk weight of 125%, while that of NBFCs attract 100%. The apex banking regulator has decided to increase the risk weight of 120 to 125% for NBFCs and 150% for SCBs. Lastly, bank credit to NBFCs, excluding core investment companies, also had their risk weight increased by 25 percentage point. This would, however, not apply to housing finance companies and loans to NBFCs classified into priority sectors. Why they why were the changes necessary? While presenting the monetary policy statement in October this year, Governor Shaktikant Das has played concerns about the high growth in certain component of consumer credit. He advised banks and NBFCs to strengthen their internal surveillance mechanism addresses the built up of risk, if any, and institute suitable safeguards in their own interest. Rating agency Moody's also put forth that higher risk weights are intended to dampen leaders' consumer loan growth appetite. RBI's figures stipulate that unsecured personal loans have increased by 23% on a year-over-year basis as on September 22. Outstanding loans from credit cards increased by About 30% during the same period. Major concerns emerge for loans below 50,000. These carry the utmost difficult default risk. Delinquencies defined as loans overdue by more than 90 days in this segment, as reported by Reuters citing TransUnion CIBIL data, stood at 5.4% as of June this year. What are the chief concerns? The primary concerns related to the impact on the capital adequacy and the bank's overall profitability. S&P latest report states that slower than slower loan growth and an increased emphasis on risk management will likely support better asset quality in the Indian banking system. However, it adds the immediate effect will likely be higher interest rates for borrowers, slower loan growth for lenders, reduced capital adequacy, and some hit on profit. However, the worst affected might be finance companies, as their incremental banks borrowing might surge. S&P states NBFCs face a double whammy because of higher risk weights on their unsecured loan and on account of the bank lending mandates to NBFCs. Bank lending to NBFC remains the principal source of funding for NBFC, constituting 41.2% of the total borrowing of entities as of March end. It is expected that the increased cost would be passed on to borrowers. Then आज का लास्ट जो आर्टिकल है स्टूडेंट Muslim student strength in higher education fell by 1.79 lakh in 2020-21. Enrollment in higher education among Muslim students in the age group of 18 to 23 dropped by more than 8.5% in 2020-21, says a report prepared from the analysis of data from the Unified District Information System for Education Plus UDISC Plus and the All India Survey of Higher Education AISHE. While 21 lakh Muslim students enrolled for higher education in 2019-20, the number fell to 19.21 lakh in 2020-21. Arun C. Mehta, former professor of National Institute of Educational Planning and Administration in NIPE, prepared the report the state of Muslim education in India. From 17 lakh 39,218 Muslim students enrolled in higher education in 16-17, the number increased to 9 lakh 21,713 in 2021. However, in 2021, the Muslim enrollment in higher education declined to 19 lakh 21,713 students from 21 lakh 860 students in 2019-20, thus showing a decline of 1 lakh 79,147 students in absolute terms. In the report says the percentage of Muslim students enrolled in the higher education relative to the total number of students enrolled also saw a slight decrease, falling from 4.87 in 2016-17 to 4.64 in 2021. The report says that a significant trend that is observed across all states and union territory is that the enrollment percentage of Muslim students in the class 11 and 12 is lower than that of the previous classes. The representation of Muslim students starts declining gradually from class 6 and is the lowest in class 11-12, while Muslims make up around 14.42% of total enrollment of 6.67 crore students at the upper primary level class 6 to 8. It is slightly decreases to 12.62% at the secondary level class 9-10 and declines to 10.76% at the higher secondary level class 11 and 12, the report states. The states such as Bihar, Madhya Pradesh have a relatively low gross enrollment ratio for Muslim students, which indicates that many Muslims residing in these states are still out of the education system. Identifying and enrolling out of school children in age appropriate classes should be a priority, the report recommends. Targeted support. The report says that 18.64% of Muslim students enrolled in the secondary level drop out of schools, which is higher than the 12.6% dropout rate for all students. Assam's 29.52% and West Bengal's 23.22% recorded high dropout rates among Muslim students, while Jammu and Kashmir recorded 5.1% and Kerala 11.91%. Implementing the targeted support and inclusive policies can help bridge this gap and provide equally educational opportunity for all, the report says. Many Muslim students come from low income families and struggle to afford the cost of higher education. To address this issue, it is essential to provide financial assistance and support to deserving students who face financial constraints, enhancing and increasing the number of scholarships, grants, and financial aid opportunities targeted explicitly at Muslim students can significantly elevate the financial burden and help more deserving students access higher education, the report recommends. So friends, this is all for today, and we will meet from tomorrow onwards with new news articles from the Hindu newspaper. Till then, thank you and keep studying.